Daddy, she looks like Mommy.
The blind date was empty until the CEO's daughter invited the poor mom. Amber Wells stepped into the cafe with a careful breath. The place was charming in a softly worn way, wood floorboards that creaked underfoot, pale green walls hung with vintage frames, and a single piano in the corner waiting to be played. The event was a blind date morning, arranged by an app, and Amber's friend had pushed her into it. "Just 1 hour," her friend had said. "You might surprise yourself." So here she was, in a dress chosen 2 nights ago, hair pulled back in a low blonde ponytail, hoping for a chance at something new. She found the table marked reserved and approached. Only 1 chair had been pulled out. She paused, recognizing that the signature of the app's setup meant someone was to join. As she drew closer, she noticed a little girl in a pink dress, legs swinging, back turned to the door, sitting alone. The girl's gaze was pointed outward, beyond the window, as if waiting for something bigger than brunch. "Sweetheart, are you waiting for someone?" Amber asked softly, lowering herself onto the unoccupied chair and placing her purse on the floor beside her. The girl turned slowly. Her dark eyes flickered to Amber's face, lingering. Then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You look like someone from my dreams." Amber blinked. She found the remark strange and kind. In the moment she forgot the routine of being a mother, of being alone, of being invisible. She simply felt seen. The girl's eyes held something ancient, as though she carried memory. Amber closed the small smile on her lips. "Oh, thank you. I didn't expect company quite like this." The girl shifted forward and placed a small hand over Amber's. "You have Mommy's hair," she said. Amber felt her heart catch. She knelt down slightly to meet the child's gaze. The girl looked away, then back. "Will you stay, just for a bit? He's always serious when he's alone." She pointed to the empty seat opposite. Amber felt the world hush for a moment. She looked at the empty seat, then at the child's hopeful face. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." Moments later, the cafe door opened again. A tall man entered, his coat hanging from his arm and his shoes clean and muted. Amber recognized the look: tailored suit, sober tie, presence calculated. The man paused briefly as his eyes swept the scene, then he saw the girl and the stranger. His breath steadied. "Daddy, doesn't she look like Mommy?" the girl asked, her voice loud enough that people turned their heads. The man froze mid-step. Amber rose from her seat, purse hanging, cheeks flushed. She said quickly, "I'm so sorry. I thought this table was mine. I didn't mean to." The man raised a hand gently. "You are at the right table." His voice was soft but firm. He pulled out a chair for Amber. Amber sat again, quietly stunned. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of relief and something unspoken. "Emma seems to know more than we do," he said. Amber swallowed, feeling the significance of the moment. The man's eyes flickered back to her hair, the same soft blonde as his late wife's. He realized that what he felt wasn't surprise at the hair or the dress. He felt the presence of memory. A hush settled over the cafe. The morning light filtered through the windows and lit the table in soft circles. The little pink dress, the low ponytail, the quiet ushering of a stranger into what would become something unplanned. Amber looked at Emma, then at the man. She thought of her own child, her own loss, and the hope that maybe for just this morning the empty seat wasn't empty any longer. The morning rush at the cafe had finally eased into a comfortable lull. Plates scraped clean, steam curled from freshly poured drinks, and the scent of cinnamon pastry hung lightly in the air. Amber Wells sat between Emma and Logan at the corner booth, the one with the patterned cushion and a small vase of daisies someone had placed that week. Emma, in her pink dress that swirled every time she laughed, stirred her hot cocoa with deliberate care, while Logan, still in his crisp suit, held a coffee untouched as though it were a letter waiting to be opened. Amber watched Emma scoop whipped cream timidly, then bravely take a sip. The child's face lit up with unexpected delight. And Amber quietly smiled, grateful for that moment, but also aware of the silent tension between the father and daughter across from her. Logan gazed at the foam dissolving in Emma's cup, his fingers tracing the cold ceramic ring left behind. Breaking the silence, Emma looked up and asked in her soft voice, "Do you think people in heaven miss us too?" The question arrived like a breeze through a closed window, quiet, unexpected, but carrying meaning. Amber glanced at Logan. His eyes had darkened with memory, lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond. Amber turned back to Emma and reached across the table to touch her small hand. "I think they miss us every day," she said gently. "That's why they send reminders. A song on the radio, a scent in the air, a kindness we weren't expecting." Emma's eyes widened. She nodded slowly, as though she understood something for the very first time. Logan inhaled, a sound deeper than regret or relief. Something shifted. Logan's shoulders, which had been stiff since the event started, relaxed. A slight smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. It was subtle, but real. The kind of laugh that slips out when you forget you've closed yourself off. Emma pointed at Logan. "Daddy laughed." Logan's gaze flicked to Amber and then back to Emma, and his lips curved properly for the first time in a long while. Amber felt her chest open slightly. This was more than cocoa and wasted time, it was the start of something. They spoke then slowly at first about trivial things. The new drawing Emma made at school, of a spaceship shaped like a shoe. Ella, the goldfish that Amber's daughter had named last week. And how spring seemed late this year. Emma talked non-stop. Her legs swung, her curls bounced. Stories tumbled out like popcorn. Amber listened. Genuinely, asking questions, pausing, laughing. Logan watched and occasionally answered. But mostly, he just let the conversation run around him, like a tide that had been reopened. When Amber noticed the time, she said softly, "I should probably head out soon. My daughter will be home, and I promised pancakes." Emma's face fell. She gathered the cocoa cup and sipped the last drop. Logan stood with her. "Amber, thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel but sure. "For making Emma smile like that." Amber's fingers touched her ponytail. "She makes it easy," she replied. It was a truth she felt more than she spoke. Logan's eyes flicked to hers, warm and unfamiliar. Emma jumped up then and ran to Amber. "Will you come back?" she asked. "We'll make space for you." Amber knelt, hugging her. "Only if you promise to keep the whipped cream for me next time." Emma giggled and nodded. Logan watched the exchange. Father, daughter, the woman who had stepped into their quiet space. He realized the seat next to him hadn't just been filled by someone new. It had opened, softly, for something real. Amber left the cafe with a slight blush in her cheeks, not from the warm cocoa, but from something deeper. Behind her, the booth remained, with 2 cups and a coffee untouched, and the afternoon sun turned the daisies golden. Logan reached out and closed the book he'd been reading. He looked toward Amber's departing figure, then at the empty cup. He took a breath. And for the first time in months, his morning didn't taste like regret. Amber stepped out into the cool morning air, her apron slung over her shoulder after a long early shift at the bakery. The street was quiet, save for the soft hum of delivery trucks and the smell of warm pastries lingering behind her. She was halfway through pulling her phone from her bag when something in the corner of her eye stopped her cold. A small figure was curled up beside the cafe's front window. Pink dress, blonde hair tied in a bow. A backpack hugged tightly to her chest like a shield. "Emma." Amber's voice broke, both from surprise and worry. She rushed over and knelt beside the girl. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing here? Where's your dad?" Emma lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks flushed. "I left school," she murmured. I wanted to see you." Amber's heart tightened. "Oh, honey." Emma sniffled and looked down. "They said I don't have a mom because she didn't love me enough to stay." The words hit Amber like a punch. For a second, she couldn't speak. She could only stare at the little girl in front of her, fragile, searching, and far too young to carry that kind of pain. Without a second thought, Amber sat down beside her, wrapping her arms around the girl and pulling her close. "That's not true, sweetheart. That's not true at all," she whispered into Emma's hair. "Sometimes people leave not because they want to, but because life doesn't give them a choice." Emma didn't say anything. She just clung to Amber's sweater, breathing unevenly. Amber gently reached for her phone and dialed Logan's number. He picked up on the first ring. "She's safe," Amber said quickly before he could speak. "But you need to come now." 15 minutes later, Logan's car screeched to a halt in front of the cafe. He jumped out, eyes scanning frantically until he saw them. "Emma," he called, rushing toward them. When he reached them, his relief quickly turned into frustration. "Emma, you cannot just disappear like that. Do you know how scared I was?" Emma looked down, tears forming again. Amber rose slowly and stepped between them. "She didn't run to escape, Logan," she said softly but firmly. "She ran to be understood." Logan blinked, his mouth slightly open. He looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw the weight she carried in her tiny shoulders, the sadness she never put into words. He knelt down and pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't hear how lonely you've been." Emma clutched him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Then she turned her head slightly and looked at Amber. "She listens," she said, voice soft, "like Mommy used to." Amber's eyes filled, but she managed to smile and brushed a hand gently through Emma's hair. Logan stood slowly, still holding his daughter, and turned to Amber. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "Really, for being there when she needed someone." Amber gave a small nod. "I know it's a lot to ask," Logan continued, "but would you let me buy you dinner, just to say thank you? For today." Amber hesitated, glancing between him and Emma. Her lips curved into a warm, understanding smile, but she shook her head gently. "Not today," she said softly, "but thank you for asking." Logan didn't press. He just nodded, quietly watching her walk away. Emma peeked over his shoulder, watching too. "Will we see her again, Daddy?" Logan looked toward the woman disappearing down the street. He didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long moment, he murmured, "I hope so." The park was lively that afternoon, filled with families gathered for Family Day, a school-organized event celebrating connection and play. Balloons floated in clusters, children ran across the grass, and picnic blankets dotted the open spaces. Amber, unaware of the school event, had simply come to unwind with her daughter Ella after a long shift. Ella, 4 years old, wore a pale yellow dress and her signature bouncy curls. Her brown eyes lit up the moment she spotted the sandbox. "Mommy, can I play?" she asked, already halfway there. Amber chuckled. "Of course, just don't throw sand this time." As Ella stepped into the sandbox, she wasn't alone. A little girl in a pink dress was already there, scooping sand with a tiny shovel. It was Emma. The two girls eyed each other for a moment. Then Emma tilted her head and stared at Ella's curls. "Your hair looks like hers," she said curiously. "Are you her daughter?" Ella nodded, still holding her bucket. Emma smiled. "Then we're kind of sisters." Without hesitation, they began building a castle together. Buckets passed back and forth. Laughter followed. They giggled over crumbling towers and made up silly names for their kingdom. Amber, watching from a bench nearby, smiled at the sight. She didn't notice the murmurs until they grew louder. "Isn't that the single mom from the diner?" "I think so. She's with the CEO's daughter. Strange, right? She sure knows where to be seen." Amber stiffened. The warmth of the moment melted into discomfort. Then came a voice, cool and condescending, from behind her. "So, this how you find a better future? Through your daughter's playground?" Amber turned slowly. A woman in designer sunglasses stood there, arms crossed. She clearly knew Logan. Amber's mouth opened, but no words came. She reached for Ella, gently calling her over. "Come on, sweetheart, it's time to go." Ella pouted. "But we're not done with the towers." Amber didn't respond. She picked her up and turned to leave. But before she could take a step, Logan's voice cut through the air. "I heard everything." He stood a few feet away, hands clenched at his sides. His eyes, usually guarded, were blazing with restrained anger. He looked at the woman coldly. "If your child had half the kindness of hers," he said, nodding toward Amber, "I might actually respect you." The woman blinked, stunned. Logan didn't wait for a reply. He turned and caught up with Amber. She had stopped, but didn't look at him. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "No one should talk to you like that." Amber still didn't turn. "People like me don't usually belong in parks like that," she murmured. "Or tables like yours." Logan stepped closer. "Then maybe it's time I stop sitting at tables where kindness isn't served." Finally, Amber looked at him. Their eyes met his, filled with apology, hers with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Emma and Ella," she said, trying to smile. "They're natural with each other. It's the adults who ruin things." Logan nodded. "Maybe it's time we learn from them." Ella squirmed in Amber's arms. "Can we come back and play again?" Amber looked at Logan. He offered a slight smile. "Anytime." Amber hesitated, then let Ella down. The little girl ran back to Emma, and soon they were laughing again, oblivious to the tensions of the world around them. And for the first time in a long while, Amber stayed. She didn't run, and neither did Logan. After that day in the park, Emma talked about Ella constantly. At breakfast, during bath time, even as Logan tucked her into bed, the same question would return with hopeful eyes. "Can we see Ella again? And her mommy too?" Logan hesitated each time. He wasn't sure what this was, what it could become. But then, one night, after Emma had fallen asleep with a drawing of her new sister, Logan stared at the crayon, smiles, and thought, maybe this matters more than what makes sense. "So," he called Amber. "I was thinking, maybe dinner? Somewhere simple. Just the four of us." There was a pause on the other end. "Simple?" Amber asked, cautiously. "Nothing fancy, just dinner," Logan said. "A small place on Maple Street. My assistant says the food is decent." Amber was quiet again. Then came Ella's excited voice in the background. "Mommy, is it Emma? Are we going?" Amber sighed, but her voice softened. "All right, just dinner." The restaurant was small, tucked between a bookstore and a florist, its sign flickering gently above the door. Inside, the lights were dim and golden, casting a cozy glow on wood-paneled walls. Emma spotted Ella first and dashed forward, taking her hand like they had never been apart. "I saved you a seat," she chirped, pulling her to the booth. Amber smiled, sitting across from Logan. She wore a simple navy dress, her blonde hair tied back as always, no makeup beyond a hint of color on her lips. Logan studied her for a moment. She looked tired, but there was something steady in her presence, something real. Emma and Ella talked non-stop about school, playground rules, and how Ella once named a goldfish Banana. Logan chuckled quietly. Amber listened patiently, nodding, encouraging. He realized suddenly, Amber was like a grown-up version of Emma. Her empathy, her calm, her way of hearing more than just words. It startled him, in a good way. When the girls got up to explore the gumball machine near the door, Amber leaned back and sighed. "I didn't plan for this," she said, watching them. "My life, it's messy." Logan stirred his coffee. "Maybe messy is just another word for real. I've had enough of perfect." Amber looked at him. "Ella asked me once why she didn't have a dad like other kids." "What did you say?" "I told her." She paused. "Some stories begin with just one hero, but that doesn't mean they end that way." Logan didn't reply, but his gaze dropped to the empty sugar packet he twisted in his hands. Outside, rain had started to fall. soft and steady. By the time they stepped out, the sidewalk glistened, and puddles formed under the streetlight. Emma squealed as the rain touched her cheeks. "We're gonna get wet." Logan smiled, pulled off his coat, and wrapped it around both girls. Then, with a quiet grunt, he picked up Emma and took Ella's hand. Amber blinked, surprised by how naturally it happened. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just instinct. She walked beside them, the four of them under one umbrella of shared laughter. They reached Logan's car soaked, but no one complained. The girls giggled in the back seat, wrapped in the oversized coat, faces glowing. Amber looked at Logan as he helped buckle Ella in. "You didn't have to carry her," she said softly. He met her eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I wanted to." Amber didn't respond. But something inside her, something long guarded, shifted slightly. A warmth, a strange, unfamiliar ease. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if maybe not all beautiful things were meant to fade. The photos hit the internet less than 24 hours after their quiet dinner. Candid shot, Logan, Amber, Emma, and Ella seated at a small table, the girls mid-laughter, Amber leaning in to wipe Ella's cheek, Logan looking on with a rare softness. The headline blared, "Widowed CEO caught dining with single mom and 2 kids, a new family?" By morning, it was everywhere. Within hours, the past Amber had buried was resurrected. Forums questioned her intentions. Blogs unearthed her incomplete nursing degree, a years-old eviction record, jobs at diners, gas stations. The words unqualified and opportunist floated beside her name. At Logan's company, the boardroom felt colder than usual. The board chair tapped her pen sharply. "Mr. Cole, your personal associations are creating unnecessary media turbulence. Investors are watching." Logan folded his hands, jaw clenched. "Are you saying dinner is a liability?" "We're saying optics matter. You are the face of this company. Your late wife came from legacy. This woman—" The chair paused, careful, "does not." The room waited. Logan said nothing. When the meeting ended, he stood, unknotted his tie in one slow pull, and walked out without a word. That night, Amber stared at the news broadcast on her tiny TV. A reporter smiled too brightly. "Who is Amber Wells? A small-town waitress with a complicated past. Is she the right match for the man behind a billion-dollar firm?" Ella played with her stuffed giraffe on the floor, unaware. Amber turned off the TV. Her fingers trembled as she folded Ella's clothes into a small bag. She'd been here before, leaving before things could break her worse. She was halfway through zipping the duffel when a knock came. Logan stood at the door, drenched from the rain. He didn't wait to be invited in. His eyes swept the room, landing on the packed bag. Amber stood, arms folded across her chest. "You should not be here." "I saw the news," he said quietly. "I'm leaving before it gets worse." Logan took a step closer. "Worse? For who?" Amber's voice cracked. "For you. You have a reputation to protect. I only have Ella." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his voice rose, not in anger, but urgency. "And you think my daughter needs stockholders more than someone like you?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Logan stepped closer. Rain still clung to his coat. "They said you don't belong in my world," he whispered. "But the truth is, I stopped belonging in that world long ago." Amber's defenses cracked. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside her, grief, fear, hope, crashing all at once. "She listens to me," Amber finally said, her voice soft. "Emma listens. That's all I've ever really wanted, for someone to feel heard." Logan nodded, the weight in his eyes too heavy to hold back. "She told me you listen like her mother used to." Amber bit her lip, eyes welling. "I don't want to be anyone's replacement," she said. "You aren't," Logan said simply. "You're the first person who ever showed up without asking for anything." A moment passed. Then, from the back of the apartment, Ella's voice called sleepily, "Mommy? Is the rain talking to someone?" Amber laughed through her tears. Logan smiled. "Tell her it's just someone who's done running." The backyard wasn't much, just a small patch of grass bordered by a weathered wooden fence, a folding table dressed with a floral cloth, and a dozen balloons swaying gently in the spring breeze. But to Emma and Ella, it was a kingdom of color, laughter, and something that felt suspiciously like home. Their birthdays were only 10 days apart, and after weeks of relentless pleading and secret plans whispered under blankets and between classroom breaks, the two girls had convinced their parents to throw a joint celebration. "Like real sisters do," Emma had declared, her eyes shining with certainty, as if the universe had already agreed. Amber had hesitated. It felt too soon, too intimate, too exposed. Every part of this, sharing space, memories, even a cake, meant inviting vulnerability. But Logan had looked at her and simply said, it would mean the world to them, and in his voice, she heard not pressure, but quiet truth. So here they were. The party was small, intentionally so. Just a handful of close neighbors, a few of Emma's classmates, and one old golden retriever from next door who refused to leave the festivities. No caterers. No photographers. Just homemade cupcakes on mismatched paper plates, streamers that fluttered under the breeze, and the kind of joy that couldn't be bought or staged. Amber set out the juice boxes on a tray, watching the girls dash through the grass. Their matching dresses, pink for Emma, yellow for Ella, twirled with every spin. Their laughter echoed against the fence, bouncing back like applause. Logan arrived carrying 2 wrapped gifts tucked carefully under his arm. He handed the first to Emma, a sketchbook with thick, textured pages and a tin of colored pencils. Her face lit up as she hugged it to her chest like it was treasure. "For all the dreams you haven't drawn yet," he said softly, and Emma beamed. Then he handed the second to Ella, a bright red toy medical kit, complete with a stethoscope, bandages, and a name badge that read, Dr. Ella. "Because your mom once dreamed of helping people too," he explained, glancing at Amber with something unspoken in his eyes. Ella's eyes widened. "Really?" Amber smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her voice caught slightly. "Really?" The two girls immediately began playing doctor and patient under the soft garden lights, giggling over invisible fevers and very dramatic recoveries. Then, just as the cake was being carried out, Amber reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "Before we cut the cake," she said, standing near the table, "I have something for both of you." Emma and Ella hurried over, hands sticky from frosting. Amber opened the box to reveal 2 tiny heart-shaped pendants, each engraved with the same delicate script. "You were never missing. You were always meant to find each other." The yard fell still. Emma blinked rapidly. Ella clutched the pendant like it was made of stardust. Then, without a word, the two girls wrapped their arms around each other, faces buried in each other's shoulders. Their small bodies shook with tears that only children cry, pure, honest, and healing in a way adults often forget. Amber knelt beside them, pulling both close, resting her forehead gently against theirs. Logan stepped forward, kneeling too. Emma looked up through teary lashes. "Now we both have a mommy and a daddy," she whispered. Amber's breath hitched. Logan's lips parted, then pressed closed as he reached forward, one arm around Emma, the other around Amber. He looked at her, not like a man overwhelmed, but like someone finally found. "You've given us," his voice broke, then steadied with care. "More than family. You gave us back our hearts." Amber didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, surrounded by tangled balloons, soft music, and a cake waiting to be cut, they all knew. Love didn't always need declarations. Sometimes it just needed a seat at the table and a second candle to share. The cafe looked different now. The once faded awnings had been replaced with soft cream-colored ones that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. Fresh flowers, lavender, marigolds, and a few wild daisies lined the windowsills in chipped ceramic pots that Amber had painted with Emma and Ella on a lazy Sunday. Inside, the light streamed through clean panes, casting a warm glow across wooden tables that had been sanded, restained, and polished with care. At one of those tables, Amber stood with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her blonde hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had grown into the space, pouring warm milk into two small mugs, steam curling like soft questions between them. Ella, dressed in her favorite yellow dress, reached eagerly for her cup, the warmth of it almost as comforting as the woman handing it to her. Beside her, Emma sat cross-legged on the bench, gently tapping out a song on a miniature toy piano set up by the window. Her pink dress caught the morning light, glowing like the inside of a seashell. The space was no longer just a cafe. It was a ritual, a rhythm, a safe place where hearts settled and laughter lingered longer than coffee foam. After the old cafe owner had retired, the community organization that supported single mothers had stepped in. They saw something in Amber, her steady hands, her quiet warmth, the way she made even silence feel safe. With their support, she took over the lease. But she hadn't just run a business. She had built a haven, the kind where neighbors left books for each other in a free library shelf near the door, where toddlers sat on mismatched cushions with picture books, and teenagers came in after school just to do homework at the big back table, where birthday candles were lit over muffins and love letters were scribbled onto napkins. Just after the morning rush, Logan stepped in. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly tousled by the wind. He paused at the door, not to catch his breath, but to take it away. The scene before him looked like a moment he never thought he'd live. Amber looked up and met his gaze. Her lips lifted, soft and knowing. "Running late?" she asked, nodding toward the empty cup beside the coffee machine. He stepped forward, his smirk crooked and familiar. "Your coffee's worth the wait." Then Emma spotted him and squealed, "Daddy, our table's still here." She leapt from her bench and sprinted toward him. Logan scooped her up, kissed the top of her head, then walked her back to the table, where Ella grinned up at him, her hands still curled around her mug. He pulled out a chair and sat, looking at them, Amber reaching to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, Ella giggling at something. Emma whispered, "The sunlight spilling like honey across the table," he said, quietly. "It always will be." Amber didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. Because, in this place, built from broken pieces and warm mornings, from tiny hands and steady hearts, there was nothing left to prove. No contracts, no ceremonies, just love. Real, daily, whole. The camera pulls back, wide and slow. Outside, the world hurried on. Inside, time exhaled. At a table meant for four, a family sipped cocoa, shared stories, and held on to something that had once seemed impossible. Forever, one morning at a time. Fade out. If this story touched your heart the way a child's words can melt even the coldest silence, and how love can grow in the most unexpected places, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And for more heartfelt stories of kindness, healing, and love that stays long after the credits roll, subscribe to Kindness and Love Tales. Every story is a reminder that hope is never too far, and sometimes all it takes is one table, one smile, and someone willing to stay. Thank you for watching.
Harrison caught his maid red-handed, stuffing his expensive belongings into her bag. For weeks, he'd been missing items, jewelry, even family heirlooms. But when this billionaire decided to follow her to expose the truth, what he discovered didn't just break his heart, it shattered everything he thought he knew about the woman who worked in his home. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the people we judge the harshest are actually the ones with the purest hearts. But first, let me tell you about Harrison Cole, a man who had everything money could buy, but was about to learn that true wealth has nothing to do with what you own. If you're ready for a story that will completely change how you see the world, smash that like button right now and trust me, you'll want to stick around for the twist at the 25-minute mark that will have you questioning everything. Harrison was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. Tall, sharp-featured, with silver-gray hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. His steel blue eyes had negotiated billion-dollar deals and stared down corporate titans. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than most people's cars, and his reputation for ruthless business acumen was legendary. But success came at a price. Every morning, Harrison would wake up in his king-sized bed, alone. He'd eat breakfast at a dining table built for 12, alone. He'd work from his home office overlooking Central Park, completely alone. The mansion that was supposed to be his sanctuary had become his prison. 30 rooms filled with expensive furniture that no one sat on, art that no one discussed, and memories that belonged to someone else entirely. You see, Harrison had inherited this house from his late parents, along with most of his wealth. The paintings, the sculptures, the antique jewelry, they were family heirlooms passed down through generations of Coles. But to Harrison, they felt more like museum pieces than personal treasures. The only human contact he had came from his small staff, a chef who came twice a week, a driver on standby, and his housekeeper. And that's where our story really begins, with Bonnie Bennett. Bonnie was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair always pulled back in a neat bun and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She stood barely 5 feet tall, with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and a voice so soft you had to lean in to hear her. She'd been working for Harrison for 8 months, arriving every morning at exactly 6 a.m. through the service entrance. She'd change into her crisp uniform and begin what seemed like an invisible dance through his home. Bonnie moved through the mansion like a ghost. Efficient, thorough, almost silent. She'd dust every surface to perfection, organize every room with military precision, and handle Harrison's precious belongings with a care that impressed even him. But here's what struck Harrison as odd. Despite her obvious competence, Bonnie never seemed comfortable around the expensive items in his home. When she cleaned his rare art collection, her hands would shake slightly. When she organized his jewelry, she'd work quickly, as if touching the pieces made her nervous. And she never, ever made eye contact when he tried to speak with her. Harrison's first suspicion began 3 months into Bonnie's employment. He'd noticed that a vintage Rolex, one of several he kept in his bedroom dresser, was missing. Not stolen necessarily, just not where he remembered leaving it. Probably just misplaced it, he told himself. He had so many watches, so many possessions, it was easy to lose track. But then other things started disappearing. A pair of diamond cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. Gone. A rare gold coin from his collection. Missing. Each incident was small enough to dismiss. Maybe he'd moved the items himself and forgotten. Maybe he'd spent the cash and not remembered. Maybe he was just getting paranoid in his old age. But then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in late October. Harrison had been working in his home office when he realized he'd left his reading glasses in the bedroom. As he walked toward his room, he heard sounds coming from inside. Soft rustling. The gentle clink of metal against metal. Harrison approached his bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, and peered through the crack. What he saw made his blood run cold. Bonnie was standing at his dresser, carefully wrapping something in a small cloth before placing it in her cleaning supply bag. From his angle, Harrison couldn't see exactly what she was wrapping, but he could see enough. She was taking something small and valuable, judging by how carefully she was handling it. Harrison's heart pounded as he watched his trusted housekeeper, the woman he'd allowed into every corner of his private space, carefully close her bag and continue cleaning as if nothing had happened. Now I want you to pause and think about this. You've just caught someone you trusted red-handed. What would you do? Confront them immediately? Call the police? Or would you try to gather more evidence first? Let me know in the comments, because Harrison's decision in this moment set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. That night, Harrison couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Bonnie had seemed so trustworthy, quiet, respectful, incredibly hardworking. She'd never asked for anything extra, never seemed interested in his wealth or possessions. If anything, she'd seemed almost uncomfortable around his expensive belongings. But the evidence was right there. He'd seen her with his own eyes. The next morning, Harrison decided to test his suspicions. Before Bonnie arrived, he strategically placed items around his bedroom and office. A gold pen here, some cash there, a small antique clock on his nightstand. Nothing too obvious, but things that would be easy to pocket and valuable enough to be worth stealing. Then he watched. Not directly. He wasn't about to hide in closets like some paranoid old man. But he made excuses to walk past his bedroom throughout the day, checking on the items he'd placed. By evening, the antique clock was gone. Harrison felt sick. Not just angry, genuinely ill. He'd started to trust Bonnie, had even begun to look forward to her quiet presence in his lonely house. To discover that she'd been systematically stealing from him felt like a physical blow. But what hurt most was the betrayal of trust. In his business world, Harrison expected deception. He'd planned for it, protected against it, even admired it when it was particularly clever. But in his home? In his private sanctuary? From someone he'd begun to think of as, well, if not a friend, then at least a trusted employee? That night, Harrison made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He was going to follow Bonnie after work and find out exactly what she was doing with his belongings. Was she selling them? Did she have a fence? Was this part of some larger operation? One way or another, he was going to get answers. The next few days were torture for Harrison. Every morning, he'd watch Bonnie arrive and go about her work, knowing what he knew, seeing her differently. Where he once saw careful attention to detail, he now saw someone casing his belongings. Where he once appreciated her thoroughness, he now wondered what else she might be planning to take. Where he once found her quietness respectful, he now heard the silence of someone with something to hide. Harrison started keeping a mental inventory of his possessions. He'd make note of where he left things, then check later to see if they'd been moved or were missing entirely. The pattern became clear quickly. Small items, always valuable, but never anything so significant that its absence would be immediately obvious. A silver letter opener from his desk. A vintage fountain pen. Another $20 from his wallet. Bonnie was smart about it. She never took too much at once, never targeted the same area twice in a row. If Harrison hadn't been specifically watching for it, he might never have noticed. But he was watching, and the evidence was mounting. What confused Harrison most was Bonnie's behavior during these thefts. When he managed to catch glimpses of her taking items, she didn't look like a criminal. She looked sad. Her hands would shake as she wrapped each piece carefully in cloth. Her movements were quick and nervous, as if she hated what she was doing. More than once, Harrison saw her pause while holding one of his belongings, staring at it with what looked like genuine remorse before placing it in her bag. This wasn't the behavior of a hardened thief. This was someone who seemed to be stealing against her own moral instincts. But why? Harrison's business mind went into overdrive, analyzing possibilities. Maybe Bonnie had gambling debts. Maybe she was being blackmailed. Maybe she had a drug problem she was hiding. Maybe she was supporting someone else who was in trouble. None of these explanations felt right, though. Bonnie didn't show any signs of addiction or desperation. She was always punctual, always professional, always seemed healthy and alert. The mystery consumed Harrison's thoughts. During board meetings, he'd find himself wondering about Bonnie's motivations. During conference calls, he'd catch his mind wandering to questions about her personal life. His business partners started noticing his distraction. "Harrison, you seem a million miles away," his CFO mentioned during a crucial acquisition discussion. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Harrison replied automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. Why is she stealing from me? 2 weeks after Harrison first witnessed Bonnie taking his belongings, he made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to follow her. Not to catch her in the act of selling his items. He already had enough evidence of the thefts. He wanted to understand the why behind her actions. He wanted to see where she went, what she did with his belongings, who else might be involved. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a desire for closure. Maybe it was the businessman in him needing to understand the full scope of the operation he'd uncovered. Or maybe, despite everything, there was still a part of him that hoped there was an explanation that would make sense of the quiet, conscientious woman he'd thought he knew. Friday evening arrived with an early winter chill. Harrison positioned himself in his home office, watching through the window as Bonnie completed her usual end-of-day routine. At exactly 6 p.m., she emerged from the service entrance, her large black bag slung over her shoulder, the same bag Harrison now knew contained his stolen belongings. Harrison's heart pounded as he watched her walk down his circular driveway. This was it. Tonight, he would finally get answers. "James," he called to his driver, trying to keep his voice steady. "Get the car." "Where to, Mr. Cole?" Harrison paused, looking out at Bonnie's retreating figure. What was he doing? Following his employee like some private detective? This felt insane, but the need to know the truth overwhelmed his doubts. "Just follow that woman," he said, pointing toward Bonnie. "The one who just left. Keep your distance, but don't lose her." James raised an eyebrow but didn't question his boss. Within minutes, they were trailing Bonnie through the streets of Manhattan in Harrison's discreet black sedan. The journey started in familiar territory. Bonnie walked past the upscale shops that lined Harrison's neighborhood. Jewelry stores displaying pieces worth more than most people's annual salaries, art galleries showcasing works by masters, restaurants where a single meal could cost a week's wages. Harrison watched her navigate this world of wealth with a strange mix of familiarity and discomfort. She knew these streets well. She'd been walking them twice a day for months, but she moved through them like someone who didn't belong. "Where is she going?" Harrison muttered, more to himself than to James. As they followed Bonnie deeper into the city, the scenery began to change dramatically. Block by block, the gleaming storefronts gave way to older, shabbier buildings. The well-dressed pedestrians disappeared. The perfect sidewalks developed cracks, and the pristine storefronts were replaced by businesses with hand-painted signs and security gates. This was a part of New York that Harrison's wealth had made invisible to him. He'd lived in Manhattan his entire life, but he'd never seen neighborhoods like this, places where people clearly struggled to get by, where every dollar mattered, where survival was a daily concern rather than success and luxury. After 45 minutes of walking, Bonnie finally stopped. She stood in front of a narrow 3-story building that looked like it had been built decades ago and hadn't been properly maintained since. The brick facade was cracked and stained, several windows were boarded up, and the small front steps were crumbling. But what caught Harrison's attention wasn't the building's condition. It was the small, faded sign hanging crooked beside the front door. St. Catherine's Children's Home. "Pull over across the street," Harrison instructed James, his voice barely above a whisper. Through the car's tinted windows, Harrison watched as Bonnie approached the building's front door. She didn't knock. Instead, she pulled out a key. She had a key, and let herself in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, lights began flickering on in the windows. And that's when Harrison heard something that made his heart stop. Children's voices. Excited, happy voices calling out, "Miss Bonnie! Miss Bonnie's here!" Harrison had followed his maid, expecting to catch her selling his stolen goods to some fence or criminal contact. But what he was about to witness inside that rundown children's home would shatter every assumption he'd made about Bonnie, about his missing belongings, and about what it really means to be wealthy. The truth was so heartbreaking, so beautiful, that it would change both their lives forever. Harrison sat frozen in his car, staring at the children's home as the sounds of excitement and joy filtered through the old building's walls. What was Bonnie doing in a children's home? Why did she have a key? And why were the children so obviously thrilled to see her? Through the dusty, cracked windows, Harrison began to make out shapes and movements inside. Small figures, children of various ages, gathered around a taller figure that could only be Bonnie. "Mr. Cole?" James asked quietly. "Should we?" "Wait," Harrison said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just wait." What Harrison witnessed over the next 2 hours would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through those grimy windows, Harrison watched Bonnie transform into someone completely different from the quiet, nervous woman who cleaned his house. She was animated, smiling, laughing. Children clustered around her as she opened her large black bag, the same bag Harrison knew contained his stolen belongings. But as he watched her unpack the bag's contents, Harrison's understanding of everything began to crumble. The first item Bonnie pulled out was the vintage Rolex that had gone missing weeks ago. But instead of selling it or keeping it for herself, she handed it to an older boy, maybe 16 or 17, who examined it with wonder. Harrison leaned forward, pressing his face against the car window. What was happening? The boy carefully wound the watch and held it up to his ear, his face lighting up with joy at the sound of its mechanism. Bonnie spoke to him for several minutes, pointing to different parts of the watch, explaining something that made the boy nod eagerly. Then, to Harrison's shock, the boy handed the watch back to Bonnie, who carefully wrapped it in cloth and placed it back in her bag. Next came the gold coin from Harrison's collection. Bonnie showed it to a group of younger children, who passed it around carefully, examining its engravings and weight. Again, she seemed to be teaching them something, about history, maybe, or craftsmanship. And again, when the lesson was over, the coin went back into her bag. The diamond cufflinks followed the same pattern. Bonnie used them to teach the children about gemstones, about quality, about how fine jewelry was made. The children listened with rapt attention, asking questions that made Bonnie smile and explain more. Harrison's hands were shaking as understanding began to dawn. Bonnie wasn't stealing his belongings to sell them. She was borrowing them to teach the children. But the revelation that truly broke Harrison's heart came when Bonnie pulled out some cash from the salary she was paid that day. She didn't keep it for herself. Instead, she used it to buy groceries that she'd clearly picked up on her way to the children's home. Sandwiches, fruit, milk. Simple, basic food that she began distributing to eager little hands. Harrison watched as Bonnie made sure every child had enough to eat. She counted heads, divided portions carefully, and only when everyone else was satisfied did she sit down with what little remained for herself, which was almost nothing. The truth hit Harrison like a physical blow to the chest. Bonnie had been taking his belongings, yes, but not to steal them. She was using his expensive items as teaching tools for children who would never otherwise have the chance to see, touch, or learn about such things. The Rolex became a lesson in engineering and craftsmanship. The gold coin became a history lesson about different time periods and cultures. The diamond cufflinks became a science lesson about geology and precious stones. The cash became food for hungry children. Every theft had been an act of education, of sharing, of love. Harrison sat in his car, tears streaming down his face, as he watched Bonnie work with the children. She helped them with homework using books that were falling apart. She bandaged scraped knees and wiped away tears. She read stories with different voices for each character, making the children giggle and clap. As the evening progressed, Harrison began to understand more about the children themselves. These weren't just any children. They were orphans, foster kids, children from broken homes who had nowhere else to go. Some looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. Others wore clothes that were too big or too small, clearly hand-me-downs that had seen better days. But when they were with Bonnie, they transformed. They laughed, they learned, they felt safe and loved. Harrison watched a teenage girl show Bonnie a drawing she'd made, beaming with pride when Bonnie praised her work. He saw a small boy with a black eye lean against Bonnie's shoulder while she read to him, finding comfort in her presence. He witnessed Bonnie patiently help a struggling reader sound out words, celebrating each small victory with genuine joy. This wasn't just charitable work. This was love in action. I want you to stop for a moment and really think about this. Harrison thought he was dealing with a thief, but he was actually witnessing someone using his possessions to bring joy and education to children who had nothing. Can you imagine how he must have felt in that moment? If this story is affecting you the way it's affecting me, let me know in the comments below. Around 9 p.m., the evening began to wind down. One by one, the children hugged Bonnie goodbye. Not quick, obligatory hugs, but long, desperate embraces from kids who clearly didn't want to let her go. "See you tomorrow, Miss Bonnie?" asked a little girl with pigtails. "Of course, sweetheart," Bonnie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll always be here." Harrison watched as Bonnie carefully packed his belongings back into her bag, treating each item with the same reverence she showed when cleaning his house. These weren't stolen goods to her. They were precious teaching tools that she was borrowing to enrich these children's lives, and she was set to return them back to where they all came from. As the last child was picked up by a foster parent or left for a group home, Bonnie began cleaning up the children's home with the same meticulous care she showed in Harrison's mansion. She swept floors that hadn't been properly maintained in years. She organized donated books and toys. She made sure the space was ready for the next day's activities. Only when everything was perfect did she finally prepare to leave. Harrison watched Bonnie lock up the children's home and begin her walk back toward his neighborhood. But instead of following her this time, he made a decision that surprised even him. He got out of the car. "Mr. Cole?" James called after him. "Sir, where are you going?" But Harrison was already walking toward the children's home, drawn by emotions he couldn't fully name. He approached the same windows Bonnie had looked through, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The space inside was small and clearly struggling. Mismatched furniture, outdated equipment, walls that needed painting. But it was clean, organized, filled with love. Harrison stood outside that building for nearly an hour, wrestling with feelings he hadn't experienced in decades. Shame for his assumptions about Bonnie. Admiration for her dedication to these children. Guilt for having so much while these children had so little. And something else. Something that surprised him more than anything. Gratitude. Gratitude that his possessions, items that had sat unused in his mansion, gathering dust, were being used to bring joy and learning to children who needed both desperately. As Harrison finally returned to his car, his mind was spinning with questions and realizations. How long had Bonnie been doing this? How had she found these children? Why had she chosen to use his belongings instead of asking for help? And most importantly, what kind of person sacrifices their own reputation, their job security, their peace of mind, all to educate and feed children who aren't even her own? The ride home was silent. Harrison stared out the window, seeing his city with completely different eyes. The wealth and luxury that surrounded his neighborhood now felt excessive, almost obscene, when contrasted with the children's home he just witnessed. By the time they reached his mansion, Harrison had made a decision that would change everything. That night, Harrison lay awake until dawn, replaying everything he'd seen. By morning, he'd made a choice that would transform not just his relationship with Bonnie, but the lives of every child in that rundown building. What he did next restored my faith in humanity, and it's going to restore yours too. When Bonnie arrived for work Monday morning at her usual 6 a.m., she found Harrison waiting in the kitchen, something that had never happened before. "Good morning, Mr. A. Cole," she said quietly, avoiding eye contact as she reached for her cleaning supplies. "Bonnie," Harrison said gently, "we need to talk." Bonnie froze. In her experience, "we need to talk" from an employer was never good news. Her face went pale, and her hands began to tremble. "Did I do something wrong, sir? I'm sorry I didn't inform you before taking your things out, but they've all been returned. Every single one of them. If I offended you, I can work harder, I can stay later, I can." "Bonnie," Harrison interrupted, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Please, sit down." Reluctantly, Bonnie set down her supplies and perched on the edge of one of Harrison's kitchen chairs, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Harrison took a deep breath. There was no easy way to have this conversation. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Bonnie nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "The children at St. Catherine's home," Harrison said quietly. "Tell me about them." The color completely drained from Bonnie's face. Her breathing became shallow, and tears immediately sprang to her eyes. I don't know what you mean, sir," she whispered. "Bonnie," Harrison said, "I followed you Friday night." The words hit Bonnie like a physical blow. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as if she were in pain, and began crying. Not just tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from a place of pure terror. "Please don't fire me," she gasped between sobs. "Please, Mr. Cole. I know what I did was wrong. I know I should have asked, but I was so afraid you'd say no, and those children, they have nothing. They know nothing about the world beyond their small lives, and I just wanted to show them something beautiful, something that would make them dream bigger than their circumstances." Harrison felt his heart breaking as he watched this strong, caring woman fall apart in front of him. "Bonnie," he said gently, "I'm not going to fire you." She looked up at him through her tears, confusion replacing fear. You're not?" "No. But I need to understand. Tell me about the children. Tell me about what you've been doing." What followed was the most honest conversation Harrison had had with another human being in years. Through her tears, Bonnie told him everything. About growing up in foster care herself, bouncing from home to home, until she aged out of the system at 18, with nowhere to go and no one to care what happened to her. About finding St. Catherine's home 5 years ago when she was desperate and hungry, and how the director, Mrs. Patterson, had given her not just a meal but hope for a better life. About how Mrs. Patterson had died suddenly last year, leaving the children's home without funding, without direction, without the love and guidance that had kept it running. "The city wants to close it down," Bonnie explained, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "They say it's not up to code, that there's no money to keep it running. But Mr. Cole, those children, they're me. They're who I was before someone cared enough to help." "So you stepped in," Harrison said quietly. "I couldn't let them end up on the streets. I couldn't let them believe that no one cared about them. So I started going there after work, bringing food when I could afford it, helping with homework. Just being there." Harrison felt a lump forming in his throat. "And my belongings?" Bonnie's face crumpled with shame. "I know it was wrong. I know I had no right. But those children, they've never seen anything beautiful, Mr. Cole. They've never held something valuable, never learned about history or science or art from real examples." She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "I always brought everything back. I never kept anything, never sold anything. I wanted them to see that there was beauty in the world. I wanted them to understand that someone thought they were worth teaching." Harrison was quiet for a long time, processing everything Bonnie had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Bonnie, do you know what you've done?" She shook her head, clearly expecting the worst. "You've taken objects that were sitting unused in my house, gathering dust, meaning nothing to anyone, and you've used them to bring joy and education to children who needed both desperately. Bonnie looked confused. Sir? You've taken my wealth and made it meaningful. You've given my possessions purpose. You've turned dead objects into living lessons. I'm getting emotional just telling you this part of the story. Can you imagine being Bonnie in that moment, expecting to be fired and punished, only to hear that her employer understood and appreciated what she'd been doing? If this story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, show some love in the comments below. Harrison stood up and walked to his kitchen counter, where he kept a small notepad for grocery lists and reminders. Bonnie, I want you to help me make a list. A list of what, sir? Everything those children need. Everything the children's home needs. Equipment, supplies, food, books, toys, repairs, renovations, everything. Bonnie stared at him in disbelief. Mr. Cole, I don't understand. I'm going to help, Harrison said simply. But not just with money. I want to be involved. I want to understand. I want to learn what you've been teaching those children. The tears that had been flowing from Bonnie's eyes transformed from tears of fear and shame to tears of pure joy and disbelief. You want to help the children? I want to do more than help them, Bonnie. I want to make sure they never have to worry about having enough food, enough books, enough hope again. That afternoon, Harrison did something he'd never done in his 52 years of life. He canceled every meeting on his calendar. Sir? His assistant asked over the phone. You're supposed to meet with the board about the merger. This could cost millions if... Reschedule everything, Harrison said firmly. I have somewhere more important to be. At 3 p.m., Harrison's black Mercedes pulled up in front of St. Catherine's Children's Home. But this time, he wasn't hiding across the street. This time, he got out, walked up to the front door, and knocked. The door was answered by the same teenage boy Harrison had seen examining his watch through the window. Can I help you? The boy asked, his eyes widening at the sight of Harrison's expensive suit and confident bearing. I'm looking for the children who've been learning about watches and coins and jewelry, Harrison said with a smile. I'm told they're excellent students. The boy's face lit up with recognition and excitement. You're Miss Bonnie's friend, the one who owns all the cool stuff. I suppose I am, Harrison chuckled. May I come in? What followed was the most eye-opening and heartwarming afternoon of Harrison's life. The children who had seemed so distant and foreign when viewed through car windows were revealed to be bright, curious, hungry to learn young people who had simply never been given opportunities to explore the world beyond their limited circumstances. When Bonnie arrived at 6 p.m. for her usual evening session, she stopped dead in the doorway to find Harrison surrounded by children, deep in conversation about the difference between various types of precious metals. Mr. Cole, she said, clearly shocked. What are you doing here? Learning, Harrison said simply, gesturing to the children around him. These kids have been teaching me things about my own possessions that I never knew. Mario stepped forward proudly. Miss Bonnie taught us all about your watch, sir. Did you know that the movement inside is called a perpetual calendar? It can track leap years. Sophia held up her notebook. And your gold coin is from 1887. That was during the Gilded Age, when America was becoming really wealthy for the first time. Tyler tugged on Harrison's sleeve. The diamonds in your cufflinks were probably formed 1 billion years ago, deep in the earth where it was really hot and under lots of pressure. Harrison looked at Bonnie with amazement. They know more about my belongings than I do. That evening, Harrison didn't just watch Bonnie work with the children, he participated. He helped Mario understand the mechanics of his vintage Rolex by taking it apart and explaining each component. He told Sophia stories about his family's history that gave context to the gold coin's era. He showed Tyler how diamonds caught and reflected light, creating the sparkle that made them so prized. But the most powerful moment came when it was time for the children to eat. Harrison watched as Bonnie began distributing the simple meals she'd bought with his stolen cash. Sandwiches, fruit, milk. But this time, Harrison had come prepared. "Actually," he said, pulling out his phone, "I took the liberty of ordering dinner for everyone." Within minutes, delivery drivers began arriving with bags and bags of food from one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. Not just enough for the children, but gourmet meals with enough portions for everyone to eat until they were completely satisfied. The children's faces as they tasted food they'd never dreamed of eating was something Harrison would remember for the rest of his life. But what moved him most was watching Bonnie finally eat a full meal herself. The first time he realized that she'd had enough food since she'd started caring for these children. As the evening wound down and the children began to leave for their various foster homes and group homes, each one stopped to hug both Bonnie and Harrison. "Are you going to come back?" Tyler asked, looking up at Harrison with hopeful eyes. Harrison knelt down to Tyler's level. "Would you like me to?" Tyler nodded vigorously. "Miss Bonnie is always sad when we have to leave. Maybe if you're here too, she won't be so sad." Out of the mouths of babes. Harrison looked over at Bonnie, who was fighting back tears as she said goodbye to each child. He saw the pain in her eyes as she watched them leave, knowing that some would return to difficult situations, uncertain futures, cold and hungry nights. And he made a decision that would change everything. That night, Harrison went home and made a series of phone calls that would transform not just St. Catherine's Children's Home, but the entire lives of every child who walked through its doors. What happened next was so incredible, so life-changing, that it restored my faith in what's possible when someone with resources meets someone with heart. At 6 a.m., just as Bonnie was arriving for work, Harrison was already on the phone with his lawyer. "I need to set up a foundation," he said, "and I need it done today." "Harrison, it's barely dawn. Can't this wait until—" "No, it can't wait. There are children who went to sleep hungry last night who shouldn't have to. There are kids sleeping on floors who deserve real beds. There are brilliant young minds trapped in poverty who deserve every opportunity I can give them. It can't wait." His second call was to his accountant. "I want to transfer $20 million into a charitable foundation account. How quickly can we make that happen?" $20 million, Harrison, that's a significant portion of your liquid assets. Are you sure you want to? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. His third call was to the city's most reputable construction company. "I need a building completely renovated and expanded. Full renovation plus additions. Money is no object, but I need it done fast." "How fast are we talking, Mr. Cole?" "I need you to start today." When Bonnie found Harrison that morning, he wasn't alone. 3 men in suits sat at his dining table, papers spread everywhere, laptops open, phones ringing. "Bonnie," Harrison said, standing up with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I'd like you to meet my lawyer, my accountant, and my contractor. We have something incredible to discuss." Bonnie looked confused and slightly overwhelmed by all the activity. "Mr. Cole, I don't understand." "Sit down," Harrison said gently, guiding her to a chair. "You're about to become the director of the Cole Foundation for Children's Education and Welfare." Over the next 2 hours, Harrison laid out a plan that left Bonnie speechless. The Cole Foundation would be dedicated to supporting disadvantaged children across New York City, starting with a complete transformation of St. Catherine's Children's Home. "We're talking about a full renovation and expansion," Harrison explained, his eyes bright with excitement. "A state-of-the-art kitchen that can serve hot, nutritious meals to 100 children. Individual bedrooms for kids who need them, each with proper beds and personal storage. A computer lab with the latest technology. A library filled with thousands of books. Art studios, music rooms, recreational facilities, and a full-time staff of qualified teachers, social workers, and counselors." Bonnie stared at him in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. "But that's not all," Harrison continued. "We're going to create an innovative educational program. Instead of just reading about history, science, and art in textbooks, these children will learn hands-on using real artifacts, real examples, real experiences." He gestured toward his mansion filled with valuable objects. Bonnie was sobbing now, but they were tears of pure joy and disbelief. "Why?" she asked through her tears. "Why would you do all this?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. "Because you taught me something I'd forgotten," he said finally. "You taught me that wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you do with what you have. You took my possessions and gave them meaning. You took objects that were gathering dust and used them to change lives." If this story is inspiring you the way it's inspiring me, let me know in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next will blow your mind. The transformation began immediately. Harrison didn't just hire any construction team, he hired the same architects and contractors who had designed museums and cultural institutions. The same attention to detail, the same quality materials, the same level of excellence that he demanded for his own properties. But more importantly, he put Bonnie in charge of every decision. Harrison hired a full-time staff of the best educators money could buy. Not just teachers, but specialists in hands-on learning, child psychology, and working with disadvantaged youth. He hired a full-time nurse and arranged for regular visits from pediatricians and dentists to ensure every child received proper medical care. He hired social workers dedicated to helping children navigate the foster system, find permanent homes, and build relationships with caring adults. He hired a chef trained in nutrition to ensure that no child would ever be hungry again, and that every meal would be both delicious and healthy. The grand reopening was scheduled for 6 months after that first conversation in Harrison's kitchen. But what happened on opening day exceeded everyone's wildest dreams. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the people around you, if it inspired you to look for ways to make a difference in your own community, then share it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share it with someone who needs to hear that their life has value, that their struggles matter, and that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin when someone chooses to see beyond surface appearances to the heart underneath.